Good evening. Welcome to the launch of Longing and Belonging, 1947 Partition Narratives. Goethe-Institut Bangladesh is very pleased to launch this collection of narratives, and we will begin by welcome remarks by Dr. Kristen Hackenbrock. Dr. Hackenbrock is currently director of the Goethe-Institut Bangladesh. She has previously conducted urban studies research in Bangladesh with a particular interest in Dhaka's public spaces and how citizens negotiate contested spaces. Dr. Hackenbrock's message was pre-recorded, and we will play her video message now. I will now turn it over to Parsa Sanjana Sajid and Professor Said Firdos, who spearheaded Longing and Belonging. I would go ahead and introduce them first. Parsa Sanjana Sajid is a writer, researcher, and often aggravated at the state of the world. She also teaches at IUB in Bangladesh and founded Fragments magazine. Her writings have appeared in the Funambulist magazine, Migrant Journal, Caravan, New Internationalist, and March, among others. She conceptualized, led, supervised, and managed Longing and Belonging. About Professor Said Firdos, a researcher in the blurred zone of history and anthropology, Professor Said Firdos has taught anthropology at Jahangirnagar University since 1995. His areas of interest include historiography, memory, forgetting, subaltern post-colonial nation-state, and nationalism. Lately, Mr. Firdos has been involved in several research projects related to 1947 partition of colonial India. His book, titled Partition as Border Making, East Bengal, East Pakistan, and Bangladesh, is awaiting publication on September 30th, 2021, from Taylor and Francis. Firdos is a co-lead on Longing and Belonging. Over to you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Durdana. Welcome to our speakers and viewers, and sorry about starting with the technological glitch, but I hope it will go swimmingly from here. Because we missed the video, just to orient you once again, that was a welcome message from the director of Goethe-Institut Bangladesh, Dr. Kristen Hackenbrock. She couldn't join us today because she is on break, but she sent the video remark, which we ended up missing. But I will get on with today's proceedings. So just to give you a sense of the evening, Said and I will introduce the project and we'll discuss it very briefly, and then we will get to our guest speakers one by one. And at the end of the session, the last half an hour, 8:30 p.m. to 9 p.m. Bangladesh time, we have devoted for Q&A. The viewers can send in their questions during the session in the comment section of Facebook Live, but we will get to them at the end of the session. So that's how it's organized. Now on to the project. And Longing and Belonging, the way we structured it, conceptualized it, is a collection of narratives, photographs, family memorabilia, archival documents from the Urdu-speaking Dhaka residents of Mohammadpur and Mirpur. There are two Dhaka areas which have large concentration of these communities who were affected by the 1947 partition. The project itself is an extension of Goethe-Institut's Inherited Memories project, and we have Nazish Afroz today who will speak later in the evening about the Inherited Memories project in detail. So, so just to kind of orient you. So Longing and Belonging itself, it's a record and a kind of archive created from jagged conversations with some of these residents and community members. These are reflections on home and belonging, identity and attachments, generational transmission of stories, and many more. I say, and I want to stress, jagged conversation to give a sense of how these stories are organized and what they stand for. They are not neatly plotted, but are presented in fragments, snippets, loose threads, and they present a continuous unfolding, a slice of lives and perspectives that can't be simplified, but they are nonetheless very richly textured. And although we use certain markers, such as 1947 partition narratives, or interviews with Mohammadpur and Mirpur residents, we want to stress the stories themselves are not essentialized. By that we mean, for example, they're not just simply recollections of the partition and the journey of migration. They're also not simply just a story of locality. 47, for example, is taken as a jumping point. And it's, but we are aware that we can take historical moments as discrete or discontinuous, but they're very much part of the present. With these narratives, our goal was to create a layered understanding and establish a sense of place and subject, which is woven into these cities, Dhaka's, fabric. There is a multiplicity of voices and perspectives here around what it means to belong, what's home, what's longing, and so on. What the political, social, cultural landscape foregrounds and hides, as is evident, for example, with stories included here on the Urdu literary practice. We cover, for example, stories from three poets, Shamim Zamanvi, who's here with us today, Naushad Noori, who has passed, but we spoke to his son, Ahmed Ilyas, who is also still very much alive. Their involvement in keeping this vibrant tradition of Urdu literary practice in Dhaka alive and perhaps failing, and their participation also in the region's left and progressive politics. So these are not simply stories, these are not one-dimensional stories. These are not stories about just, for example, migration or trauma or even resilience. They're very richly textured. We also have the story of, for example, a woman named Muni Akhtar, who resides in one of the Mirpur camps, who migrated after partition with her husband. And I quote some sections from our collection, and I start the quote. Our husband's relationship with his family was troubled. A new land beckoned, so he left without a word. Forced by her husband's lead, Muni left with the same silence, the same foregoing of goodbyes. She didn't get a chance to say goodbye to her family. She has not seen her family since, and her husband passed away 25 years ago. Munni isn't sentimental about India, but nurses a lingering sadness for the lost connection to her family. Her heart aches and burns for her siblings. She said, and I quote her in Bangla, "Oita ki desh prem," meaning, is that love of country? To Munni, the idea of desh, meaning country, remains uncertain, ambiguous. She arrived and settled in a new place on the arms of her husband. He was her country, so to speak, quote unquote. And when he died, Munni said she truly felt like a woman without a country alone. There's also the story of Naushad Noori's wife, as told by her son, Haikal Hashmi. And he was telling us how when she talks about her pre-partition days, her younger days, she speaks about the past as present. She speaks in the present tense. So time for her, even kind of the historical moments or time that she has lived, is still very much present. And finally, when we talk about any of these things, we began with the understanding that archiving and recording, notions of identity and place, are tenuous and porous. There is no one story and community. Again, to take one example, the formal category of classification in Bangladesh, for example, is Urdu-speaking community. But there are people here who spoke Bhojpuri, or their families, for example, spoke Bhojpuri. So Urdu is not, in fact, it's, as an umbrella term, entirely accurate. So we sometimes and often in our narratives have used Indian emigres, to quote Ahmed Ilyas, who actually think that that's a more better encapsulation. So that's why we call these jagged conversations. But together they convey a richly complex and composite pictures that are still rough around the edges. I will, again, when we end, I will kind of show where to find these narratives. They're available online. Just briefly, the website address is longing.belonging.net. But when we get to the discussion session, I'll screen share and show where they're. I will now ask Said to say a few words as well. Said, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Parsa. Uh, it's really been an honor for me to be part of this project. And I thank Parsa Sanjana, my friend, to involve me in this project. And basically, it's her brainchild. The project was basically her brainchild. But I really like this idea that history is not frozen in the past. History is not something we are talking about that which is archaic in numbers and like stuck at remote places and remote time. History is there and past is present in our in around us. So that's the thing, that all the story that how the past holding in the present, and that has real.
Said, you are breaking up a little bit.
Consequences in the present. It has consequences in the lives of the people. Turn off the video. Should I? You hear me? You hear me?
Yeah,
now?
turn off the video. Yeah.
Okay, let me see. Yeah, now can you hear me? Is it working now?
Yeah.
Is it working? Okay.
It's working.
Okay, okay, fine, thank you. So what we are talking about is we are talking about past, but we are not talking about past only. We are talking about past in the present that has currency in the present and that has consequences in the present. So through the narratives, we can see that we are not looking back at 47, but we can see that through 47, how people translating meta history, how people translating events and consequences of meta history in their everyday life. They're translating 1947 into their sense of community. They're translating 1947 into their identity. They are translating 1947, the idea of Desh or nation or the nation state. They're translating it to the idea of home and to the idea of self. So it's interesting to see how this is still, and often in other places we have heard that some Urdu speaking person was telling to the researcher that we haven't left the country left us. So it's like another kind of story, like the scenario has changed, the large political scenario at the backdrop has changed, but that has consequences in the people's lives. So yes, these are actually these fragmented, these forgotten bits of pieces are like gems. They're like treasures, and tapping on them, we can really look back to history. We can really look back to past, but we can really look into the relationship between the communities in the present. We can really look into the relationship with nation, state, and its others, assumed others. We can see the relationship between like the dominant in the nation, in a nation state, and how the others are entangled with the dominance in that complex relationship. So it's interesting that we really can ask, if we think about the future, this is not any, we haven't produced any coherent piece of writing. It's just a collection. It's just a collection of memories. It's a collection of narratives. And it's an account, it's a collection of photographs and memorabilia and those things. So the thing is, what we can do, we can really go for writing. We can bring up arguments, and we can provoke the younger generations who are not familiar with this idea of meta history and those things. We can bring up empathy and sensitivity to understand the relationship between the communities within a nation's unequal and complex relationship of the communities within a nation state, within the umbrella of a nation state. So that is what we are thinking about. I think Parsa would also agree, whether it would be an academic piece of writing, whether it would be a popular writing in a popular genre, but we will definitely go for a coherent write-up based on these stories and narratives, and we can think about that. The other thing, what we want to say, what I actually claimed in my partition research, in my doctoral research, that partition history still very much Indo-centric and Punjabo-centric. It's more about, we talk about Punjab too much. We don't talk about Bengal. And when we talk about Bengal, we don't talk about Assam. We don't talk about, like, we talk about Kolkata, but we don't talk about Dhaka. That is another part. Dhaka was ever neglected, and Dhaka was the other place constructed by the people who had to leave Dhaka sometime, at some point. So that is another. But what happened to the people who had to stay back in Dhaka? So this is another thing that beyond the Indocentrism and beyond the Punjabocentrism, we can think of the greater horizon and connectedness between these, the then colonial India, and now divided into 3 states. So this interconnectedness between 3 states. Even today, this session has been telecast, the live telecast is going on in Calcutta page, but it is not going on. We have no connection with Karachi. So it's still a taboo. It's still a kind of glass wall. So we can think to go beyond that. We can think of real connectedness between the people who had suffered to the same grain of history, who have joy, and on the other side of that, who have tears and bloods. So we can connect this different kind of different people and in different countries in this within this so-called subcontinent. So we can really bring up those things in the future trajectory of this work. So I'm really thankful to our teammates, not only to Parsa, but to our teammates. And I'm really thankful to Goethe-Institut for being generous to us. There are eminent writer Shaheen Akhtar, who actually was in a workshop session here, was our friend Manas Chaudhary and Abonte Harun. They were also, they have conducted a workshop with our team. So I acknowledge them, and I extend my thanks to them as well. And thank you very much for being here this evening. Wonderful people. Anam is here, and Shamim Bhai is here, and Najesh is here, Javed Bhai is here, Khalid Bhai is here. Thank you to all for this, making this session graceful and making this session interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Parsa and Professor Said. We will now begin hearing from our invited speakers. First, we have Khalid Hussein. Hussein will talk about what it means to share stories and community tales. Khalid Hussein is a human rights lawyer and the founder and chief executive of the Council of Minorities, a minority rights-based organization in Bangladesh. Khalid belongs to the Bihari Urdu-speaking linguistic minority, a formerly stateless community of Bangladesh, and has worked on statelessness issues on behalf of the Bihari community since 1999. During his career, he has been deeply involved, working in the field of statelessness and citizenship rights. Over to Khalid Hussein.
Very good evening, everybody. As Parsa said about me, and thank you. I really thanks to Goethe-Institut because they have done really wonderful work, longing, belonging these projects. And I think before that, Inherited Memories of Bengal Partition was the first initiative of the Goethe-Institut. And I really say thanks to Goethe-Institut because, you know, the Biharis are completely neglected community in South Asia or subcontinent. If I say particularly in Bangladesh, because, you know, the Urdu is the enemy language in 1952. So relation to 1952 and 71. So we are completely neglected. Still, the people are living in 116 camps. So I say this project is completely benefit. It will give the benefit for the Urdu speaking community. What I believe, because storytelling is really important. Now it's around 74 years of partition, and if you visit any camps, like we have 116 camps all over in Bangladesh, so you hardly find some people. Still some people are those are eyewitness of 1947, and we had so many stories within the communities, you know, but we lost very important stories of 1947, the struggle of 1947. Somehow we have very small the generation like Ahmad Ilyas, M.I. Faruqi, and some other people. Those are still alive, and still we have time to collect this type of stories. I just say my mom say if someone watched the film of Promised Land, the documentary film of made by Tanvir Mukammil, and on that film, the first time when Tanvir Mukammil was interviewed to my mom, and first time I just experienced her experience, and she said when she started her journey in 1947 from Patna to East Pakistan, now is Bangladesh. She was with her family with the train bogie, and she said within the one bogie we started from India to Bangladesh, and still they have to pass their 3 months within the bogie. They cook there inside and they sleep inside. So after that they just reach in Santahar, and then she started their life there. So this type of so many stories during they started their journey to staying in this country. So many people are experiencing, and my father, you know uh, he his life, he traveled, I mean he migrated twice, I mean thirds. First he born in Patna in India. Then he was, I say must say, it's forced migration to East Pakistan. And then after, he self, willingly he went to Pakistan to visit her son and daughter, and after that in 2003 he was died there. So one person, can you believe the three countries he's moving? Just born is in Patna, and then grown up, raised up in Bangladesh, and the last of the age, he was stuck and dead in Pakistan. So now for my generation and for the next generation, it's very important for us to know the stories. What is our roots? This telling story can update us, our generation and the next generation, about our struggles, where from we are here in Bangladesh. Say we are Bihari, non-Bengalis, and Urdu speaking community, and gradually this nomenclature is going to be changed within the community. Because when we started our struggle in Bangladesh the first time, before the ending of the statelessness in 2003 and 2008, we believe we will establish our nomenclature as an Urdu speaking community in Bangladesh, because we are Muslim community. Our ethnicity is quite same to the Bengalis. We are not religious minority, we are linguistic minority. So we thought, okay, we can say we are linguistic minority, we are Urdu speaking community. But believe me, if you visit in the camp, we don't speak Urdu. We speak completely Bhojpuri, completely the Bihari language. There is no any script of the Bihari language, but we must say the Bihari language. I mean the Bhojpuri mixed, Maithili and Bhojpuri mixed. But we don't have any choice to claim ourselves who we are in Bangladesh. So in 2008, the first time the code declare this community, they are Bangladeshi citizen and they are Urdu speaking Bangladesh. That means first time we got our nomenclature from the High Court. High Court declare they are the Urdu speaking Bangladeshi. So for our generation, the next generation, this is really important to collect these stories. I have memories of camp. I born in camp in 1981. So, and I left the camp in 2009, and now I'm living in outside the camp. But inside the camp, in my childhood, it was so congested. Now the camp is very, building based, 2 story, 3 stories building based. But that time it was Havel. It was Havel, small tin and tin and bamboo made the houses. So I just clearly remember when at night or in the evening the electricity was off, then whole the young generation and the childrens and the older generation, they sit together in front of their gate, and they started telling their stories. And it was not just for 1947 or 71. Even some people say about their past, how they are living in India, and after that in Bangladesh, and what happened with them in 1971. And even sometimes they they told a story about the Raja Rani, the kings and queen, and I mean so many stories. So within that sitting, I just learned so many things from my father's. The Indian happened in Patna. My father was born in the Hilsagram is just near to the Patna. So how he just flew out from India, and how in front of his and his brother, his mom and his sister were died, and so many this type of stories. So if I say to my kids, I have two kids, two sons, and they completely unaware about our roots. You know, in my family, my wife is Uriya. She belongs from the Odisha, and I belong from the Bihar. But my two children, they are completely unaware about our identity. They are going to school and they're speaking the Bengali language. So I think if this type of stories collected in an archive, the Indian root, Indian origin. We are belong to the Bihar. We are belong to the Odisha. So very funny things, in my family when and my kids are watching the TV, and there is a fighting between the Pakistani army and the Bangladeshi. So I have seen how they love their country, but they don't know about the Biharis. Even they don't know they are belong to the Bihari or Urdu speaking community, but they show their revenge against the Pakistani army, against the Bihari, even against the Bihari. Even my two sons, they fight together, and they they themselves say, I'm Pakistani army, and I'm Mukti Bahini, and the freedom fighter. So this is, I believe this is important. This type of stories and struggles, how the Biharis and Indian Muslims are. And one thing is, one thing I must say here, it should be proved two nation theory was completely failure theory. Because of religion, the India was divided in Pakistan, and then Pakistan has been broken in Bangladesh. So if this type of story will come out, why my parents were migrated? Just because of religion. They believe the Pakistan will be the umbrella of Muslim, and we are not safe in India, so we have to go to Pakistan. Even they don't know about the Pakistan. Where is the Pakistan? How is the Pakistan? And the people they are living in the East Pakistan, they didn't have any idea. The Bengalis are living here. Their language is different. Their culture is different. They just their brain was just washed. You are Muslim, you are not safe in India. So Pakistan will create some Islamic state, and you will be safe. You can practice your religion in Pakistan. And for that, so many people killed in India and Pakistan, Hindu, Sikh, and the Muslim. And what we got, the Islamic State of Pakistan. You can see in the present situation of Pakistan, if you say this Islamic country, still they are fighting with Shia and Sunni. So where is the Islamic umbrella? The Biharis, they lost everything, I think. The partition, if I say the partition and the creation of India and Pakistan, we are the most suffered community in this subcontinent. We got nothing. We got nothing. At least the Bangladeshi community, they got the Bangladesh country, Sindhi, Balochi, Pakistan. Sindhi, Balochi, Pathan. They have the four states, and we are neglected in India. The Muslims are treated as an Pakistani agent in India, and Bangladesh. We are the Bihari. We are treated as an stranded Pakistani. We are treated as a war criminal, ally of the Pakistan army. In Pakistan, the Biharis are in two groups, the Muhajir and the Biharis, and Biharis are treated as a Bangladeshi, as a Bengali. How I mean, if the Pakistan was the umbrella of Muslim, then why there is no place of the Biharis in Pakistan? Still, my brothers last month they call me and they say their identity card has been blocked because they are living in Orangi town, and all the Orangi town populations come from Bangladesh. So the government said you have to prove your forefathers or your fathers coming here in this place before 1971. They don't have anything. The strange thing is, my younger brother, his name is Wahid Murad, He migrated from Bangladesh to Pakistan in Orangi. So when he need the national ID card, he had to face so many problems, and he has to change his father's name. Can you imagine, to get the national ID card in Pakistan? So this is the reality of the Biharis. This is the reality of uh, partition. This is the reality of 1947. So I think still the community people, they thought, if this type of story will be projected in all over the world, at least they can get some sympathy from the mainstream community, because we are the sufferer community from India to Pakistan, Pakistan to Bangladesh. So these are completely. I mean, still the people are surviving in the camp. So where is the benefit of 1947? We just left everything. We just left our properties. We just left our business and the lands and all those things. So I think this type of activities go on must be before inherited memory. I didn't find anything, this type of archive of the storytelling, any activities in the subcontinent, even in India, Pakistan, or Bangladesh. Just once, 7 years ago, I just come to know about the 1947 archive in California based NGO. They are doing the archive of 1947. If you visit their website, you can find so many stories of Punjabis, so many stories of the Sindhis, so many stories of the West Bengalis, and there is only 4 or 3 stories of the Biharis. Those are living in Bangladesh. And 7 years ago, their team, two volunteers came from California, and they contacted me, and I just managed 4 or 7 people from the camps, and they collected their stories. And now in their website, the 4 or 5 stories of the Biharis is there. So I think more and more work should be done in Bangladesh with this community and their stories, and the story should be the audio visual, and after, and what is that after you have so many stories, you have the archive, and how can this story should be projected in all over in the globally. So my idea is, I think it should be go through with some literature work, writing some novels, some documentary film, some dramas, I think some pictures should be picturized with this struggle of the participants, of the partitions witness. And maybe stage drama should be very important. I think I just heard from the Ahmadiyas before 71, the Urdu stage drama was very famous in Dhaka, but now it's completely dying. So why not we should start something Urdu drama? I mean, the culture of the Biharis is nothing, I say. Just only, I just believe, is Mushaira and the Qawwali. I just face so many issues when I just travel to UN and some international forum to represent the Biharis, and they just ask, "What is your culture?" So I was just thinking. Then I have to go to the Google. What is the Bihari culture, and especially the Muslim Biharis culture? I just find the Qawwali and then Mushaira. So we need to work more and more work about the culture of the Biharis, the language of the Biharis. The language is also very important. We are by force saying we are Urdu speaking, but believe me, we are not Urdu speaking. We are Bhojpuri person. So many, even just last week, I'm just holding a senior minority fellow of OSCHR, Geneva, Switzerland based UN. I'm holding UN fellowship right now. So they just asked me, they are going to organize a workshop, South Asian Regional Minority Forum, and they have developed a banner, and they should include every language there. So they just send me, and they say, okay, you just translate this code to this code in the Bihari language. I was surprised, the Bihari language. Then I just Google it. There is nothing, no any script. So I just say, no, yes, I am Bihari, but I don't have particular language. So I can say I can translate it in Bangla, even not in Urdu, even not
Mr.
in Urdu,
Khalid, if you
because
could just
Urdu.
wrap up quickly, we would like to move on to the next
Yeah,
speaker
thank you,
with
thank you.
limited
So
time.
so this
No, it's
so
okay. You
so
can finish and then we can.
yeah, yeah. So this is the challenges with this Urdu speaking community. Those are living in Bangladesh, and the other challenge I just say within this 30 second. there is two type of Urdu speaking people are living in Bangladesh. One, they are living inside the camp, and the other side, those are living in the outside camp. If you want to get some stories from the camp dwellers, you can't, because they lost their memories and they are not educated. They didn't maintain their diaries or anything. But you go outside the camp, you can talk with the Ahmadiyyas. Ahmadiyyas can be tell you so many stories, so many things, narratives of 1947. If you talk with the MI Faruqi, so you can get something from there. So inside the camp is very difficult. So still we need to find out some people, those are inside the camp, to collect their stories. Thank you, Parsa. And sorry for overtime.
Thank you, Khalid bhai. So we should go to Anna. Can you introduce Anam, and then we can move to Anam.
Thank you, Mr. Khalid Hussein. Our next speaker is Anam Zakaria, who will discuss oral history and narratives as inheritance. Anam Zakaria is the author of 3 books: 1971, A People's History from Bangladesh, Pakistan and India, 2019; Between the Great Divide, A Journey into Pakistan-Administered Kashmir, 2018; and The Footprints of Partition Narratives of 4 Generations of Pakistanis and Indians, 2015, which won her the 2017 KLF German Peace Prize. Over to Anam Zakaria.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Firstly, just a big thank you to Khalid bhai for really powerfully highlighting the importance and primacy of storytelling and documentation. And also just want to say I'm very grateful. I just want to thank you all for inviting me to be a part of the launch of Longing and Belonging. It's truly an honor for me to be here. And I just want to start off with congratulating everyone involved with the project and in making this possible, particularly Parsa and Professor Firdaus and the Goethe-Institut Bangladesh. The Inherited Memories project as a whole, both phases, hold a very special place for me. The project has been instrumental to my own research and my own understanding, and I've learned immensely from the narratives collected in the earlier phase of the project. I'm looking forward to learning more from Longing and Belonging. As some of you might know, I have also drawn from these narratives, including Khalid bhai's narrative in my book, 1971, A People's History. And in many ways, I think my book would have been incomplete without the generosity of the people who shared their stories, and the Goethe-Institut for giving me the permission to learn and share these myriad experiences through my work. I'm now delighted about the launch of this new and important phase of the Inherited Memories project. Longing and Belonging, as we've heard today, brings forth visual materials, narratives, experiences, threads, fragments, nuances that are essential in paving the way for further research and enhancing our understanding of the partition of 47 and its ongoing impacts. We are now close to 75 years after the partition of 47 and 50 years since the birth of Bangladesh. And it is increasingly evident that the experiences and memories of those years continue to shape us. Far from being static, quote unquote, events that we can leave behind, Longing and Belonging reminds us of the ways in which our present leaves imprints on our understanding of the past, and the past impacts our present. Memories and histories are passed on from generation to generation, taking on new meanings and revealing, in many ways, I think, the journey of partition after partition. In my work on the partition of 1947, which is primarily in Punjab, and I'm very cognizant of what Professor Firdaus and Khalid bhai mentioned, that so far the lens has been Punjab-centered whenever we research and look at partition, and this has to be acknowledged and very much addressed. But in my work, I have been curious about the ways in which oral histories are transmitted and inherited. Conversations with 4 generations of Indians and Pakistanis, and later some Bangladeshis too. And the eldest here was about 112 years old and the youngest 9, so huge kind of age difference. These narratives and conversations reveal that partition continues to take on unique and new meanings in the post-partition years. It shapes both the sense of self and the other, the ways in which we determine and define nationalism and patriotism, the ways in which we determine who belongs and who does not, who is quote unquote a loyal citizen and who is not, and who has found themselves on quote unquote the right side of geography and who has not. Oral histories then are essential to document and archive, not just from the generation that lived through the partition, but also with the post-partition generations that have inherited these histories, memories, and often trauma as well, that of course continues to manifest in so many different ways. I also want to mention that I think this tradition of storytelling and the transmission, the oral transmission of folklore, songs, legends, culture has a long history in South Asia, and in many ways was undermined by colonialism and the importance given to the written text over the oral narrative. As a third generation Pakistani myself, I know that for me, going back to oral histories from my own grandparents, but also others in and around me, has been such a poignant way to understand my own history and heritage and the way it shapes my present, especially in a context where school textbooks and mainstream discourse has often filtered, fabricated, or erased parts of that history for the service of various national projects. It was through my grandparents' stories, for instance, that I came to learn about the Hindu and Sikh friends and about the ways in which family members were saved by members of the quote unquote other community amidst the violence of partition. This holds a lot of importance given the one-sided violence focused on in the national discourse, which often demonizes minorities, religious minorities in particular. With regards to 1971 as well, it was only through the oral history interviews that I conducted that I was able to disrupt state silences on the birth of Bangladesh in Pakistan. People remember what the state tries very hard to forget or erase. State violence of 1971, as well as the small resistance movement by poets, intellectuals, and activists then based in what was West Pakistan, are nowhere found in conventional sources of history, but continue to be embedded within people's memories. In my own context, then, these oral histories enable me to challenge the otherization process I had grown up with, questioning some of my own biases in state-enforced erasures. So these oral histories, as Professor Firdaus mentioned as well, are really treasures and such an important part of our inheritance. I also think that it is through these oral histories that we can come to understand how different events are interwoven and interrelated, shaping the memory of prior events. And I say this in quotations because I think the term events in itself implies or gives the impression that these experiences in some sense are static, frozen, and unchanging, which is hardly the case. For instance, while 47 and 71 are often spoken about separately and written as separate histories, in the Inherited Memories Project and in other oral history interviews, one comes to see how the two are connected for so many people and the ways in which 71 continues to shape the memory or the lack thereof at other times of 1947 itself. Many people in South Asia have lived through and been impacted both by the partition of 47 and then the creation of Bangladesh in 1971. And their children and grandchildren's lived experiences continue to show us how these events continuously have resonance in the everyday and are not seen as distant, removed historical moments that we have simply left behind. Oral histories then, I think, can really serve as an important resistance to the ways in which master narratives and state narratives tend to homogenize and often essentialize people and histories, leading to nuances, lived experiences, fluidity of identities and of memory, often being packaged into very neat binaries and classifications and into linear kind of storytelling. The mosaic of memories and narratives documented by Longing and Belonging team are then essential in helping us move beyond these status understandings and homogenization. But at the same time, I think memory is, of course, very malleable. And as I said earlier as well, it's shaped by events, quote unquote, that take place after the event being discussed. So by exploring inherited memories, we can also come to understand then the shifting meanings of partition, of belonging, of longing, of the interpretations and the meaning making of the past and how it's influenced by the present, as well as the ways in which master narratives impinge on and influence personal memories. They show us the ways in which the past can both be glorified, romanticized, or villainized. For example, we know that in Pakistan, India, and in Bangladesh, each country has its own larger meta history and a unique way in which the partition has been institutionalized. And in many ways, in the post-partition years, we've also had we've had partitioned histories and partitioned access to these stories and archives and other forms of documentation. And what these master narratives or these meta histories do is that they have a huge impact on personal memory as well, enabling some stories to come forth more easily and others perhaps, being sidelined, discounted, or discouraged because they may be seen as inconvenient histories and may disrupt the national narrative in some sense. Conducting oral histories in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh has indicated to me that contemporary dynamics in regional relationships and internal politics all influence the ways in which people remember and make sense of the past, what they choose to share, what they choose to not share, what becomes silence, what has to be forgotten, and what can be remembered. In Pakistan, for instance, stories of one-sided bloodshed are reinforced by the state, and post-partition relationships, between India and Pakistan, including wars and the ongoing conflict in Kashmir, have an impact on the memory of partition itself. So school children today can largely understand the past through the dynamics of the present. For the first few decades of my life, I too received partial oral histories from my family. The state discourse meant that to be nostalgic or to long for life across the border could be construed as unpatriotic. Packaged stories of bloodshed and violence came forth, only disrupted with other simultaneous narratives of rescue and protection when I started to ask different questions. Oral histories as inheritance thus tell us not only about the histories in themselves that may be not found in conventional sources, but also about remembrance and forgetting. It shows us what people choose to hold on to, 75 years later, 50 years later, what they choose to pass on, what remains unsayable has to be forgotten. It indicates both what can be narrated and what must not or cannot be narrated. Inherited narratives bring forth personal histories and important insights into the collective present, giving us a glimpse into both the past and the ways in which it's interwoven into the present. So I'll end there, but just another big, congratulations to the entire team and to Goethe-Institut Bangladesh for supporting such an important and critical project. I'm very grateful for your efforts, and I'm really excited about the new pathways these textured and layered narratives and archive opens for further research, learning, and understanding. And thank you so much for having me as part of this launch.
Thank you, Anna.
So much. Should I introduce the next speaker?
Yes, please.
Now we turn to Shamim Zamanvi, an avid poet who will share a few lines from his poems. Shamim Zamanvi is a poet and translator. He has published several volumes of poetry and works of translation. Over to Zamanvi.
Thank you, Parsa. I am a very simple and small poet in the field of literature, and I am still learning literature. But some friends and Madam Parsa made me something from nothing. I used to compose triangular, the shortest form of Urdu poems. So it is called Salasi. That means triangular. It is invented by the great poet Himayat Ali Shair, which was in the period of Faiz and Faraz. Actually, he was contemporary poet, and I use Salasi, very shortest form of poem. Just please listen. First Salasi or triangular. आंसू पियो लबों की हंसी बांटते चलो, आंसू पियो लबों की हंसी बांटते चलो, गर चाहते हो अमन से कट जाए जिंदगी, उल्फत से नफरतों के शजर काटते चलो. My second solasi or second triangular. जमी के रुख पे लहू का निशान बाकी है, जमी के रुख पे लहू का निशान बाकी है. हवस की प्यास बुझे क्या हवस परस्तों से, जमीन बांट चुके आसमान बाकी है. My third solasi, third triangular. जमी सवाल करे लाजवाब कर दूंगा, जमी सवाल करे लाजवाब कर दूंगा. शमीम अपने अमल पर मुझे भरोसा है, मैं बूंद बूंद लहू का हिसाब कर दूंगा. Actually, this triangular is invented by Himayat Ali Shayar, and I invent with the mixture of Hindi, Devanagari, and Urdu language. Triangle, and its name is Tribhuj. Hindi and Urdu mixture. So first Tribhuj. पापी के अंगों को छूकर जल भी नीर बहाता है, पापी के अंगों को छूकर जल भी नीर बहाता है. पश्चाताप की अग्नि से ही होता है पापों का अंत, आग में तपकर सोना भी जैसे कुंदन हो जाता है. सेकंड त्रिभुज. धोखा कभी नहीं खाते हैं सरल ज्ञानी उत्तम लोग, धोखा कभी नहीं खाते हैं सरल ज्ञानी उत्तम लोग. अपनी सीमा लांघने वालों का होता है ये परिणाम, सीमा से चतुराई बढ़कर बन जाती है टीका रोग. माय थर्ड त्रिभुज ट्रायंगल. धनवानों को उनका धन ही नींद से रखे दूर, धनवानों को उनका धन ही नींद से रखे दूर. ऊपर वाले की लीला को कोई समझ नहीं पाया, हाथी घोड़े बेच के सोए एक निर्धन मजदूर, हाथी घोड़े बेच के सोए एक निर्धन मजदूर. Now just these Solasi and Tribhuj. Ms. Parsa, may I say something about
yes, please. Yes,
poetry?
please. Yes.
Some verses. Listen. बहरे ताजीम नए दौर के आजर जागे. फुल फॉर्म ऑफ पोएम. बहरे ताजीम नए दौर के आजर जागे, मेरे हाथों के तराशे हुए पत्थर जागे. कोई तूफान अभी साहिल से नहीं उठ सकता, कोई तूफान अभी साहिल से नहीं उठ सकता. अपनी मौजों की हिफाजत में समुंदर जागे. कोई आवाज तो दे, कोई दरीचा खोले, कोई आवाज तो दे, कोई दरीचा खोले. शहर का शहर है गाफिल, कोई हमसर जागे. सो गई वक्त की आगोश में कितनी सदियां, सो गई वक्त की आगोश में कितनी सदियां. कितने लम्हात तहे तेग भी होकर जागे. और गर्दिशे वक्त समझिए न कभी जुल्मत को, गर्दिशे वक्त समझिए न कभी जुल्मत को. रात आए तो सितारों का मुकद्दर जागे. और ये शेर. तुझको सुकरातो अरस्तु की जरूरत क्या है, तुझको सुकरातो अरस्तु की जरूरत क्या है. अहदे नौ तेरे लिए कोई सिकंदर जागे, और मुझको क्या खाक तमन्ना हो बहारा की शमीम, याद के जख्म ही बन बन के गुले तर जागे. Thank you, Ms. Partha. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Shamim Bhai. Ludana next.
Thank you, Shamim Zamanvi. We will move on to the next speaker, who is Javed Hussein, to discuss Urdu poetry and the cultural, political, social scene. Javed Hussein is a writer, translator, and voracious reader. He is with the newspaper Prothomalo.
Thank you. Whenever you're talking about Urdu literature, culture, then there are some distinct features of this language, which is largely misunderstood, especially in this Indian subcontinent. For one such perspective, like most of the Bengali people in Bangladesh, they think that Urdu is the language of Pakistan. And it's a language which belongs to the enemy camp. The tradition, the history, and all other features which has, make people understand about Urdu has very few positive kind of vibes. So first we have to know something about the Urdu culture. The first thing is that Urdu, which is the most syncretic language in Indian subcontinent, as you can get from information from one of the courtiers of Emperor Akbar, Abul Fazl, he said that there's a language which is understood from Lahore to Bengal. And that was the language Urdu, which was vastly understood, which was vastly used in all over the Indian subcontinent to connect, to communicate within hundreds of languages, religions, and cultures. And another interesting thing for Urdu is that now, which is vastly divided, and people used to mix up language with religion, like the Hindi is for the Hindu people and Urdu for the Muslim peoples. One interesting perspective from history is that there's no different languages as Urdu and Hindi. There was a single language which used to call Rekhta or Dehlevi. In 1801, when Fort William College was established, one of the first tasks Fort William College people provided or assigned to the Muslim scholars and the Hindu scholars to write different books on Urdu and on Hindi. But as you know, that there was no different languages called Hindi and Urdu, so the Muslim scholars, they vastly lean on Arabic, on Persian, on Turkish, and they produce some literary works vastly on prose, and we used to call them now at Urdu. And when the Hindu scholars, when they were assigned to write some prose works on Hindi, as there was no such language as Hindi, they just kept the syntax, the grammar of Urdu Rekhta, and excluded all the Persian words, Turkish words, and Arabic words, and replaced them with Sanskritized vernacular words. So from that day, we got two different languages, Urdu and Hindi. But in reality, there's no different language called Urdu and Hindi. Now come to the second point. Urdu was so syncretic. In all over India, you will find different kind of Urdu, Punjabi Jama Urdu, Makrani Jama Urdu. And when you go to southern part of India, you will find, Dakni Jama Urdu. And the same way in Bengal, you have Hush Bash. In old Dhaka, there is in Dhaka Urdu. and Urdu, which is largely leaned on East Bengali dialect, with the grammatical terms and other points from Urdu grammars, but vastly collected its words from East Bengali Bangla. So you see that Urdu has this different flavor, and one of the most recent language which is born in Indian subcontinent. So in Bengal, there was a different history of Urdu literature. Urdu is basically a city-based language. You call it Tamaddun, based on Medina, that means city. Urdu was basically always centered or focused on cities. But in Bengal, I mean the eastern part of Bengal, the history was quite different. The only instance probably for Urdu, where Urdu was cultured and nurtured in the rural part of this land. Because when the Mughal penetrated in this part of India, I mean in Bengal, in the eastern Bengal, then when the other people who were ruling Bengal, the Sultani time of Bengal, they all fled from the cities. And they began to, nurturing their culture in the rural part of Bengal, the rural part of Sylhet, in the rural part of Mymensingh. There was a very rich and very vibrating culture of Urdu poetry and Urdu prose, which is quite unique in the history of Urdu literature. Now, so the most important thing is, which I'm trying to make clear before you, that Urdu has not started, the people who were writing poetry or prose, they have not started writing in Urdu after or on 1947. There is a long old tradition of Urdu culture in Bengal. And after 1947, people from different parts of India began to rush in Bengal. And as Khalid has already said, that all of them were not Urdu-speaking people. They were Uriya-speaking people. They were Bhojpuri-speaking people. There were people who were speaking other dialects. But as there was a favorable environment in East Pakistan in favor of Urdu, so people used to make them introduced as Urdu speaking. So the most important thing is, as Naushad Nuri has already stated in one of his very important essay, that the literary scenario in East Pakistan after 1947, it was largely dominated by civil bureaucrats. They used to write Urdu poetry, Urdu prose, Urdu stories, Urdu novels, and they used to dominate the literary scenario at that moment. But there were other people at the same time, other schools of Urdu literary culture. One of us old school. They used to write poetries in old manners. They used to reside in Delhi. They used to reside on Lucknow, in their head, in their mind, in their thoughts. Though they're physically, they used to live in Bengal. At the same time, there were other people, those who used to call them Jadid, the new school of poetry, the new school of literature, who used to write poetry in a different manner. And most of them were influenced by progressive political thoughts. So after 1947, in Eastern Bengal, there was a lot of small literary circles. Some of were led by prominent, people who are very influential in the society. Some of them were influenced by specific political thoughts and ideologies. There was a lot of literary circles in whole over Eastern Bengal. In Saidpur, in Khulna, in Chittagong, in Sylhet, in Mymensingh, and of course in Dhaka. So when those literary persons used to write in Urdu, the new poetry, there were some people, some poets, who were very much aware that the land on which they are writing their new poetry, it demands some specific attention. You will find this in Naushad Nuri, कि रंग सबके एक हैं, जज्बात सबके एक हैं, जागते सोते में एहतिसाब सबके एक हैं, दिल में इतने वसवसे, आंखों में इतने रंज व गम, मुनहसिर हम पर नहीं, हालात सबके एक हैं. Which can be translated in something like this, that we all share the same colors, the same feelings, wake or asleep, our emotions are the same, such apprehensions in the heart, eyes full of such pain, independent of ourselves, our conditions is the same. So Naushad Nuri is trying to make a bridge between the people of two languages. But the scenario in reality, the political landscape of the time, it was not in favor of people like Naushad Nuri or poets like Naushad Nuri. So when specifically in 1952, when the language movement started, Naushad Nuri was one of the first poets in this eastern part of Bengal who wrote a poetry in favor of 1952 language movement. And his very famous poem was Mohenjo-daro, where he was alerting the people of East Bengal, saying that, oh, my countrymen, like the Mohenjo-daro, 1,000 years old civilization, who have lost all its literature, its stories, its songs. O people of my country, O people of Bengal, be aware, be prepared, preserve all your stories, all your songs, carve them on stones, carve them on metals, and be prepared. A tsunami-like storm is coming. Be prepared, preserve all what you have in your language. And as a result, he was compelled to leave Pakistan, and he was migrated to Calcutta. He lost his job. And in 1952, there was an organization which used to call its name at Anjuman-e-Taraqqi-e-Urdu, a council for the promotion of language, Urdu language. The East Pakistan part of this council, they detached themselves from the Council of West Pakistan in favor of the language movement. In 1958, in the era of Ayub Khan, there was a very clear distinction between the Urdu poets. Most of the old school Urdu poets, they got in favor of Pakistani regime, and the poets who used to feel themselves attached with the progressive ideology, who used to work with the Progressive Writers Association. They very openly stood for the cause of Bengali people. One of such poet, his name is Surur Barabang. At that time, he wrote a couplet which goes something like this: Na kisi ko fikr manzil, na kahin suraghe jada. Na kisi ko fikr manzil, na kahin suraghe jada. Ye ajeeb karwan hai, jo rawan hai be-irada. He was singing about Pakistan. What's going to happen about the future of the state, which is so bizarre, which has divided its people into different camps. What's going to happen with this state? So he thought, and he expressed his thoughts in this way, in this couplet. No one is thinking about the destination. There's no clue what's going to happen about the future of this state. Ye ajeeb karwan hai, jo rawan hai be-irada. And this caravan, this state, this caravan is moving as if it's not one to move. So this was the poets, the literary people of the Pakistan era after 1947, who found themselves in different camps, and some of them, they were smart enough at that time, who were walking ahead of their time, who thought that they should get themselves attached with the larger community, irrespective of their language, irrespective of their religion, irrespective of whether they belong to the same literary culture, to the same history, to the same geography or not. In 1971, we have talked about Naushad Nuri. He used to publish a newspaper, a weekly, named Zarida. It was vastly and largely published for the cause of the independent movement of the Bengali people. And it was financed and backed by Tajuddin. In one of the issue in January 1971, the front page of this newspaper, it was totally black, and there was a very large headline, Teri Najat, Meri Najat, Chenukat, Chenukat, which can be translated something like this, that your freedom, my freedom, is in 6 points. Chenukat, which you call in Bengali as Choy Dafa. And that was the last issue of that newspaper. After 1971, the scenario was completely different. Urdu, the language, was already designated as a language of enemy. But one very interesting thing happened at that moment. After 1971, there was a very big waves in Urdu literary culture in Bangladesh at that moment. The change was dramatic after 1971. Despite the extremely polarized situation in the years after 1971, several literary and social organizations, they cropped up. Halqae Ahle Kalam, Halqae Yara, in Chittagong, Makhzan Adab in Khulna, Halqa Ahbab, Manzil Adab, Markaz Tehqiq Adab, they were in Saidpur, and Halqa Fikr Danish, Bazme Asifi, Bazme Khatib, Dabistan Adab. These were the organizations or circles in Dhaka. They held party sessions, literary evenings very frequently. And the affix was, very unique. Urdu speaking people, they published so many books and literary magazines after 1971, which was not seen before 1971 East Pakistani cultural scenario. But the situation at that moment, it was not to be continued, because all those people who used to organize all this, frequent mushairas, literary gatherings, used to publish all these books and literary magazines, they were the product of earlier period.
Mr. Javed, you have 2 minutes to wrap up. Just a reminder. Thank you.
I think that will be enough. So those people, they were the product of before 1971 time. The new generation in Bengal, in Bangladesh, they are not interested about Urdu language or literature. They have the least scope to make themselves acquainted with Urdu literature, because they feel themselves threatened when they speak Urdu outside of their house or outside of their camp. So now Urdu has found its refuge in university Urdu departments, where there is very small scope that you can expect some people will come from there who will write Urdu poetry or write Urdu stories. And there another place, the religious institutions, the madrasas, they use Urdu for their education as we use English in Bangladesh for our educational purpose. The only hope for Urdu in Bangladesh is through translation in Bangla language. And there's another scope, which I think the academic people, they should tap it. If you want to know the real history of this subcontinent before the British, you have to go to Urdu, you have to go to Persian. So these are the scopes, these are the only scopes where Urdu have some prospects. Otherwise, there's only one thing I can mention, reciting a couplet from Shamim Zamanvi. कोई तो हो जो अंधेरों को बाखबर कर दे, फराज़े दार पे रोशन चरागे सर कर दे. There should be someone who should enlarge the darkness. There should be someone who should put the lamp of beheaded head as a lamp over the height of the gallows. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Javed Hussein. Before we move on to the last speaker of the evening, might I remind that the audience who's watching from our Facebook page can always leave questions and we will address them at the end of the show. Our last speaker of the evening is Nazis Afroz. Afroz will share his reflections on the reach of the stories and the role of an audience and his experience from the first phase of inherited memories. Nazis Afroz has worked as a journalist for nearly 40 years, 18 of which for the BBC, covering current affairs spanning South, Central, and West Asia in the capacity of a producer. And later, as a senior editor, Nazis supervised and led the research project on third-generation memory of the Bengal partition on behalf of the Goethe-Institut in Calcutta and Dhaka. He continued with the project with a photography work titled Uncertain Memories, Refugee Memories of Kolkata, which was exhibited in Kolkata in 2018. Over to you, Naza Safros.
Okay. Thank you, Durdana, and thank you, Goethe-Institut Dhaka, for inviting me to speak today. And as Durdana has just mentioned, that it was my privilege to lead and to supervise the earlier project, the project that started it all, Inherited Memories, My Grandparents' World. And this is something that we have been discussing all evening. This is something that Anam mentioned at length, and this is something Parsa also mentioned, that this is about collecting stories, this is about collecting memories, this is about preserving memories. And so let me talk about that earlier project a little bit. That project was conceptualized by the two previous directors of the two Goethe-Instituts, one in Kolkata, one in Dhaka, Friso Mecker and Judith Marschberger in Dhaka. Now, Friso used to quote one German writer quite frequently when we were discussing this project. And it was Johann Paul Friedrich Richter who said, memory is the paradise from where one cannot be driven. And so this was one of the starting points of a project. I came in slightly late, and so I took the concept. It was my responsibility to give it a shape and at the same time to implement it. And I had an advantage meaning, yes, I was from Kolkata. I lived in Kolkata and worked in Kolkata for a good part of my life. But at the same time, I had huge friend circle in Bangladesh, in Dhaka. And Bangladesh was almost like my second home. So you mentioned Shaheen Akhtar, who came for one of your workshops. Shaheen is one of my oldest and closest friends from Dhaka. There are many such friends. My friend Tariq Masood, the filmmaker who died untimely in a road accident. So I first heard about the Biharis, the Bihari refugees who used to live what they called the Geneva camp in Dhaka. It was still called the Geneva camp in the 1990s when I first met Tariq. So all those information, the consciousness of the communities that had moved across the two borders was known to me. And so it was not that difficult for me to design the project. And it was meant to be a project which was to be videographed and then and put the entire project in text as well as the videos on a website. For various reasons, we could not interview a large number of people. We chose to do 10 interviews on each side of the border. And while choosing, and I'm coming to what the links to the link to the project that we are discussing it this evening, is that while discussing about possible respondents in Dhaka, in Bangladesh, not only in Dhaka, in Bangladesh, we had to look at absolutely at the Bihari community. And I'm consciously use the word Bihari community rather than the Urdu-speaking community. And having lived in Kolkata, and we know that the language that the Biharis speak, this is anything but Urdu. This is a sort of a mishmash of Bhojpuri, a Maithili, a bit of Urdu. It has its own character. And so, so we wanted to definitely put the Bihari experience into our project. And that is how I first met Khalid and his interview. His interview was about an hour and a half long, maybe a little more. And it was so revealing. And I'll just tell you one little anecdote from the project. One of our young researchers from Bangladesh, he was still a student at that time. We had 15 researchers who conducted those interviews. I did not do, I was supervising them, but we had 15 researchers from both from Kolkata and from Dhaka and Chittagong. And so when we interviewed one of the people from the Mirpur camp, after coming out, and even when we were preparing for the project, I could hear, so one of the researchers, a young student, he kept saying that, why should we talk to these people meaning the Bihari people? They did not support the cause of our independence in 1971. And so we said, no, this is not how history works. History is much bigger, and you have to have the nuances, you have to have the stories from all sides, and then only we can make a judgment. Involved with one of the interviews of one of the Bihari respondents from Mirpur, and after coming out of the interview, he told me, Naziz, my ideas have changed totally. And this is something that I mentioned it because this is what such projects that we are talking about, they do. They do bring out stories. And this is something Khalid mentioned, that stories are so important. And in the end, what are we left with? We are left with stories. And those are the stories that if we have to sort of not only preserve, but we have to present it to the future generation, and for them to assimilate, for them to deconstruct, for them to understand what happened and why it happened. It's not only a few historical events that led to certain say fissure in certain sort of historical timeline. And as Saeed said right at the beginning, that and Anam also reflected that partition history is so Punjab centric, and one of the reasons could be that the extent of violence that happened in Punjab, the unspeakable violence that happened in Punjab. That way, Bengal did witness a lot of violence, but it was nowhere close to what happened in Punjab. That is why I think Punjab always was focused. I mean, a lot of researchers, they focused on Punjab. And in Bengal, when we come to Bengal, we saw that, yeah, a lot of people, they moved because they witnessed violence, but at the same time, there was the general sense of insecurity that also led them to move across the border. And so in this, so when we did this project and we were doing that, and possibly this was the first project in which we wanted to look at both sides of the border. We did not want to make it about the Hindu refugees who moved from East Pakistan into Bengal or into India. You know that the numbers were like, for every 10 Hindu refugee, there was one Muslim refugee who went from Bengal into East Pakistan. So that was the ratio, 10:1. But we did not, but the number does not really decide anything. So we needed to look at the entire picture. We needed to give the entire picture. People moved for various reasons. Why did so many Bihari Muslims land up in Bangladesh? This is something that we needed to look at. That is why when we chose respondents in Dhaka, we made sure that there were equal number of Bihari refugees. And it's not only the Bihari refugees. So we were doing that project almost, almost 65 years after the event. So there have been mixing. So we chose two respondents, at least two respondents, where one respondent's father was Bihari, mother was a Bengali, and there was another respondent whose father was a Bengali and mother was a Bihari. And we wanted to see, because we also wanted to trace the cultural, the cultural traces. We wanted to look at the cultural traces that all these families, they carried with them. And when we talk about culture, it is not only the language, it is about the food they ate, it is about the way they spoke, this is about the way they dressed, this is about the way their weddings took place. And even in those interviews with the Bihari respondents, they said that in our wedding, there is the tradition of putting sindoor, the sindoor, the vermilion that normally the Hindus would put on the forehead of the bride. And this is a tradition that they brought from Bihar. And this is a tradition they still follow. So they were misunderstood. So a lot of them were ostracized because of one particular kind of cultural practice that they brought with them when they came from Bihar. Despite being a Muslim, of course, Urdu language was one of the big point of friction for them. So that way, we also wanted to look at all those, cultural traces that they carried with them. And I'll just come to this point that Anam made earlier. And because history is not only about talking about the past, also the history, and we can see all of that. The story of the Bihari community that moved to East Pakistan in different parts of East Pakistan in 1947. Many of them thought that, so there was a resolution of their question of identity. But did it really happen like that? No, within 25 years, their identity was questioned again. So there is no certainty. So always the past, it shapes us, our present, and that is how things go on. You know what is happening, and this is something Saeed also mentioned earlier, that what happened in Assam, we are talking about Bengal, and what happened in Assam, that 1.9 million refugees, they have been, just like the Biharis, they have been they have been told that they're stateless, they do not have the right to live in India any longer. A large number of them have been sent to detention camps, and 80% of them are Hindu refugees. So in 1947, thinking of these refugees, they thought that they were moving to a country which was a Hindu majority country, and so they could go to any part of the Hindu majority country, and they could live there with safety. But their linguistic identity in Assam, or for that matter in any other states in the northeast of India, now again, there is absolutely no certainty of the future, and this is something that absolutely goes on. So when
Mr. Narcis, you have about 2 minutes to wrap up. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. And so this is something that we discussed right at the beginning, and this is what we brought in, and we wanted to see how people react to these stories as well. And when you hear the story, if you listen to the interview that Khalid gave to the first part of the project in Inherited Memories, or another woman respondent from Kolkata, where she was describing how her mother's uncle, and so in both the stories, there are these stories of gruesome killing, but these people in their third generation, in their own way, they have made peace with that, but at the same time they're also looking forward. So that way, these are the projects, I think, again, as Parsa right at the beginning said, that these are the narratives which are not, which are fragmented, rough on the edges, but at the same time, they're extremely important to make a sense of what has happened in the past and where it will take us to. That is where I'll stop.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
We have some questions through our Goethe's Facebook page. I could actually start. I mean, I just want to kind of actually discuss or respond to some of what Anam and Khalid Bhai said at the beginning. And then I'll, get into some of the questions that were asked, and we'll open it up for Q&A and discussion. One of the things when Khalid Bhai was saying that that there is this bifurcation, that there are stories in the camps and there are stories outside of the camps, and the stories outside of the camps are overrepresented, and that's again situated within this general landscape where in partition stories, Punjab stories are mostly represented, and what happened in Bengal, is not as well represented. And within that, when we come and choose a very specific location like Dhaka, not to say that even in kind of the Urdu speaking, Bihari speaking community, there are other same communities in Saidpur, in Khulna, in Chittagong. We didn't even get to that. But even in Dhaka, there is this bifurcation in camp and outside of camp. And people who live outside of the camps and are moved from the camp to outside of the camp, there is obviously a class marker. People tended to be more privileged or somehow made it possible to move outside. And those who stayed back in the camps, again, there is a specific class position that marks their experience. As a result, they are not as represented, or they did not probably preserve, for example, family photos, did not have a chance to kind of sit down and kind of recollect, what they or their families went through. But through our kind of interviews, we actually visited the camps multiple times, and we tried to, for lack of a better term, I want to say capture, but it's not about capturing. We had multiple conversations in trying to kind of understand who are still in the camps, their experiences. And when I, at the beginning, the Munni Akhtar, for example, is still a Mirpur camp resident. We have had people who recollect, or not even recollect, kind of like share their experiences of that location. And in Mirpur, for example, one person was saying how they have kind of seen Mirpur change and grow, right? In Mohammadpur, we have had similar types of testimony. And what I wanted to say that it's not simply about kind of understanding a community or a group of people kind of disconnected from the locale or kind of the general social space, but it's to kind of situate that these people's experiences, their lives, what they have seen or what they have built, how they have moved, are in fact very much part of the narrative and fabric of the city. We try to capture them, but again, I do want to say capture probably is not the right word, but we try to kind of like show them in that fragmentary sense, in that sense that there are still rough edges, in that sense that they're still in flux. And I think that's one way to understand these narratives. And in terms of when Khalid Bhai was talking about culture, I would say that, yes, I mean, I wouldn't kind of like think about only, mushaira or only kind of Urdu poetry practice, because that I would think, I may be wrong, that kind of minimizes it, because it can be that and stand on its own. But at the same time, there are other ways that we can also think about culture. Culture is not simply about kind of like practicing poetry, right? If we look at the food, and for example, biryani, right? It's very famous, like fare in weddings in Dhaka. And from the early stages, if you look at the cooks, right? Or people who kind of like popularized biryani in Dhaka, you would see the contribution of this community. In art practice, you would see, and again, like I'm saying food and music and poetry, still it kind of like, I would say somehow thinks about culture in a static sense, but culture is more than that. So I would think that there is definitely a more expansive way that we can think about culture in this sense. But let's get to questions, and I actually wanted to start with asking a question to Anam, because she has, done work on oral history. We actually, like all these stories that we collected are some part of that tradition, collecting oral history. But my question is, when we are in fact recording, right? When oral history is kind of transcribed in written form, right? What does it gain and what does it lose? Khalid Bhai was saying that, like his memory is of sitting in the camps and people would just share stories. And so there is that transmission of stories that stays oral. And there is a different way of transmitting it, and it transpires in a certain way. But here we are talking about oral history, but we are trying to give it certain written form. So what is kind of, the implication of that, basically?
Thank you so much. That's a really great question, and one I've been thinking about, and I was also talking about this very recently. I think a lot is lost from the oral to the written. I think some is also obviously gained because there's another form of documentation and sharing, and I think that opens ways or opens questions for other people. And then I know that many people have gotten in touch with me saying, we read these narratives and then we went and we actually spoke to our grandparents or other people in our family. So I think the written can sometimes also provoke more oral history collections. I think the two are very much interconnected in the interest that, but a lot is lost because when you are translating the oral to the written, all the silences, the pauses, the way something is uttered, the fragmented nature of that utterance, the non-verbal language and communication, all of that is very difficult to translate or to mirror onto the page. So I think a lot about this, and I've been thinking increasingly about, is it even possible? And how can more of an effort be made to transfer some of that onto the page? So when we are writing oral histories, I think traditionally, even now, something I grapple with is, do we need to bring coherence? Do we need to move around the narrative to create flow? And I'm increasingly questioning that, right? Because especially when we're recording oral histories, a lot of times these are also trauma memories that we are recording, and they're not necessarily coherent. They're not necessarily coming forth in that narrative sense. So is it possible then to take these fragmented utterances and the silences that come up and actually show them on the page? Even then, of course, it's not something that can be neatly translated. I think we need to be aware that there's a transition that is happening and there's a transformation that is happening. Every time we record, we transcribe, and then we reproduce in any other form, something to be very cognizant of. At the same time, I think it gives it a new life and then can, in fact, provoke further oral history narrative recording in other forms as well.
Thank you.
Parsa, can I just add just a line to what Anam just said? I mean, sure. I just mentioned it, that when Khalid was narrating the story of how his father had witnessed the death of his mother and the other female members in Patna. Khalid's father had witnessed this as a young boy. And the other respondent in Kolkata, the way she was narrating the death of the uncle of her mother, which her mother had witnessed. And so I was personally present in almost all the interviews. I just wanted to actually feel how they were talking. I wanted to see the demeanor. And this is something that absolutely surprised me, that their absolutely calm demeanor, the way they described, and you could not feel that there was any bitterness while they were describing it. It was a trauma that they inherited from their families. And one would expect that there would be some sort of resentment, some sort of bitterness, some sort of anger. But that was absolutely not there in these interviews, a lot of these interviews. And this is something really interesting, that how when you transcribe them in written form, when you read Khalid's interview that he had given to us, and you really would not understand when he described it, how he described it, and what was going on inside his mind. or the other respondent that I'm talking about. So this is very, very important, and that's something surely would be lost.
Thank you. All right, let's move on to the questions. We have around 3 to 5 questions. And we will try to get to them, all of them, hopefully. So first question, I think, like anybody can take it, but maybe Saeed, you can also try to, begin, and then others can also add. What's your hope how these narratives and stories will be used? What's, going forward? What's their use? Who's going to use them? How? Saeed, do you want to?
Yeah, as I said before, it's about creating sensitivity and creating empathy, understanding. You should have it can raise the idea of effort to understand the other, and like to bridge or to connect with the other, like not to get rid of that idea or the division that we are not going to talk to these people, rather to listen to them, to understand their life, to understand their emotions that may stand against my reality, but that can help necessarily. So this contradictory or against the grain narratives or accounts can definitely broaden our thought process and can get rid of the narrow idea of nation, state, and those polity, and get rid of that and think about human across the boundary, think about the relationship across the boundary. So that is important. I think particularly the way South Asia is heading in today's politics, like we are talking about NRC in Assam, like it's like we are talking about what is happening still, what is happening in other parts of India-Pakistan border, and what is happening still in the Bengal border. So it's always interesting to see this kind of story can help one to reconfigure the idea of self, and it can be broadened only. So yes, that is, and that challenges the narrow monolithic construction of nation and state that Anam was actually saying about the Pakistani textbook about the 1971 war, like creation of a monolithic truth, and people's memory and people's account only can challenge and dismantle. So it's always interesting to listen what is something unfamiliar, something unknown, something we perceived as anti to me. It's better try to understand that. So these accounts can definitely serve in that way, I think.
Anybody else?
Parsa, yes, absolutely. And as Said just mentioned, that what is happening in politics across South Asia, nationalism and patriotism, I mean, those are the buzzwords. Those are influencing our present. And we saw what happened with the NRC. And some of the recording, and I had a bit of fear that whether those can be used. For example, in Bengal, very right-wing nationalist politics is just feeding into the memories of East Bengal refugees, saying that, okay, you had been wronged and you had been evicted from your motherland, and so you came here as refugees, so you have to be anti-Muslim, and for that you have to be in our fold. That kind of narrative, that kind of political dynamics that we see. But at the same time, can we really not talk about it? Of course we need to talk about it. And then things change in the way the kind of violence that the Sikh community in West Punjab had faced, or the Muslims in East Punjab had faced. And among the Sikhs, there was for decades, there was this massive anti-Muslim sentiment. You see what has happened with the NRC movement and the participation of the Sikhs. And the two communities, the Muslims and the Sikhs, have come together for the first time in the history of India the way it has never happened before. And they stood by each other. The Sikhs came in huge numbers. Why did they come? Possibly they were the ones who were displaced ones. And this kind of narratives I've seen when I did the follow-up project on certain memory, and I was interacting with the refugee 1947 and 1950, between 46 and 47, and then 1950. The next riot, a major riot that took place in Kolkata, was in 1964, when there was a lot of riot in Dhaka. And there was riot going on in Kolkata. So inside the refugee colony areas, there were few Muslim families. And so the Muslim families were afraid. They thought that they would not, that, okay, they would go and they should just take revenge on these Muslims, even though they did not have any role to play in any of the riots. But the seniors, the leaders of those refugee communities, there are documents that they had their meetings, and they said that we had been displaced once. How can we go and displace others? If they are stored,
okay, I think you're breaking up a little bit.
Oh, okay, I think
also,
my internet.
Yeah, we also need to move on to other questions.
Yeah. So those kind of stories definitely help in the understanding of the other community, the other.
Thank you. If I just may add, we have a couple more questions that I'll get to, and we are almost out of time, but if I may take, I would like to take, if it's possible, 15 minutes over time, but we will try to wrap like 9:15 sharp. One thing that I thought of, in kind of thinking about this question, it's obviously, as Said said, to create a complex understanding. And he also said to create a sense of empathy. And as I was kind of working through these kind of interviews, narratives, also other kind of like documents, texts, photographs, one thing that I grappled with, and I don't necessarily have an answer to that. One is obviously when we think about an archive, a record, we always have to think about, even though, right, we try to make amends, right, create as multifarious a document as possible collectively. There is still certain decisions, in fact, as people, as researchers that we are taking. So the nature of the archive is contingent. It has parameters. And I do think it's important to remember one thing. And second thing, and I think the more important thing for me is that these are, again, creating a kind of record that is hopefully creating a more complex picture about the notion of nation, identity, belonging. At the same time, in the question of otherization, I don't know that we can or have addressed, and I'm not talking about longing and belonging, the nation, the idea of contingency. For example, what I mean that in terms of otherized subjects, right, sympathies always depend on humanization. What it means is that we think that our sympathy depends on them being good subjects, right? And as a result, if they are not good subjects, we still, very quickly take away those terms of sympathy. And I would say that actually, in fact, happens constantly. Even people who are citizens of a nation, right, are constantly have to navigate those contingencies and otherness, and otherwise, they're criminalized many different ways. So I do wonder, right, what kind of that underbelly of humanization is, because the terms of humanization is constantly contingent, constantly, dependent on a kind of very limited sympathy, as if like only people, good subjects, are deserving of our sympathy and others not. So that's something, again, like I don't have an answer, but I do think about, and I did think about this as we were creating this collective document. But let's move on to some other questions. And there are two questions that I'm going to ask together because they're related. One is, number one is, are there any marked ways the younger generation are navigating these questions of belonging and longing? And then another one from one of our actually team members. I visited many of the localities of Urdu speaking community. Here I saw the dilemma between thinking, the difference in thinking between the older and the younger generation, namely people who experienced partition. They spoke about in a nostalgic manner about their homeland, and people who are third generation or younger, who were born here, who are part, are thinking about their part in the nation state maybe a little differently. They wanted to establish their identities as Bangladeshis more vehemently. So how, again, the question being like, what is this changing scenario, right? Where the older and the younger generation and how they're navigating these questions. And again, any of the speakers who want to take this question on, maybe even, Khalid Bhai, Javed Bhai, Saib.
Yes, I want to go with the second question regarding the older generation and the young generation. As you know, we are working on the legal issue of the Biharis. We have the paralegal program in different camps in Bangladesh, and our paralegals are helping the camp community to achieve the civil documentation. So during our activities work, we started this work in June 2013. So initially, at the beginning of this project, when we organize the group meeting and we invite the older generation to talk about the Bangladeshi citizenship and 2008 High Court judgment, how you become Bangladeshi citizen and you have the national ID card. So the first initially in the beginning, the older generation, they didn't accept. Yes, we got the national ID card because of some people file a writ petition in High Court, and after that we are forcibly Bangladeshi citizen. But gradually, when we just go on with this project now, even the older generation, they realize really the Bangladesh is the last stage for them. This is the country for them. So because the Pakistan are not going to take anyone, and they are not treated them as a standard Pakistani. So and the other thing is the older generation are depending on the young generation. They are completely retired. They don't have any job, anything. So young generation, their kids are working, and they are determined. They don't themselves in Bangladesh. So now, if you visit the camp, now the scenario is the older generation, the young generation, they all are Bangladeshi citizens, and they realize the Bangladesh is their homeland and their country. Recently, we have conducted a small research, and we found in Geneva camp, there are 23,000 people are living in there, and most of people, they have the national ID card. That means the older generation also realize there is the last place for them.
Thank you. Next question, again, I'm going to, there are a couple of questions on kind of Urdu practice and Urdu literary practice. The first one was, so if, again, Javed Bhai mentioned that after 71, there are these flourishes of different literary societies. Again, like when I spoke to Shamim Bhai, he mentioned that, how he came from Chittagong to Dhaka to set up one such Urdu poetry society. But at the same time, I think through our interviews that has kind of been very clear, and Javed Bhai also mentioned that there is a vanishing horizon. So if that's the case, and it is in fact vanishing, and the newer generation don't feel such an attachment to the language, to the practice. And in fact, Haikal Hashmi, who is the son of Naushad Nuri, told us, I'm the last person in my family to speak Urdu. and after me, no one else. My sons and subsequently no one else will speak this language. So the question is, how do we think about creating remembrance of this practice, which is still a practice? It is still very much alive, but there is a vanishing horizon. And then the other question is, if we do think about quote unquote reviving, again, qualifying the word reviving, because there is that kind of like temporal, notion attached to it. But if we do think about reviving, what are the avenues of reviving, especially in the country's current context of, lack of freedom of expression? Javed Bhai did mention slightly that in kind of academic setting, but at the same time, that is, like a language, a practice that is so kind of vibrant and rich and part of, again, lived reality. To think of it in kind of just the academic, practice, it immediately kind of limits it. So I would ask maybe Javed Bhai and others kind of like, say a few words about where do you see this horizon, moving, if we are to kind of somehow revive it? Or is there any hope? Or we will end up in failure?
Urdu is largely oral tradition based. Now, specifically Urdu poetry is largely oral tradition, which has given such popularity. In mushairas, it doesn't matter how big poet you are, you have to attend the mushaira, where the people are gathering from every wake of the society, from the university professor to the, to the petty hawkers. They will gather in the same occasion, and you have to prove yourself as a poet. It doesn't matter how big you are. You have to prove yourself on that occasion by reciting your poems orally. So Urdu literary tradition is largely oral based. If you don't have any, listener, you don't have any Urdu poetry. As far as I have observed Shamim Bhai, he used to, participate in the online mushairas. In these mushairas, people are participating from all over the world. So if you don't have any people around you to hear your poetry, to hear a story, then you don't have any Urdu poetry or Urdu literature. So how bitter it may be sound that Urdu literature is not going to survive in this country, I don't know, after 10 or 15 years. So that's a bitter reality. I think
First, may I?
Yes, please.
Yeah, it's just, as an anthropologist, I can understand that any cultural trait can only survive when it has life among the people. So that's the thing, like if the next generation is even becoming Bangla Bhashi or speaking in Bangla, so how come the language, how come the mushaira will survive here? How come the poetry or literary practice will survive? So, and this is, yes, this is sad, this is bleak from, if we consider from the perspective of the earlier generation. But think about from the younger generation. For them, this is the reality. As Khalid Bhai was saying, that for his sons, this country is their country. This language is their language. So the sadness is actually there that like people, or that is the way of language, that is the way of culture, that is the way how people get different trajectories to shape their identities in different way. So yes, but that itself also marked by the marginality, like when the younger generation wants to shift to a new identity and the older generation wanted to cling to the nostalgia and cling to the past. So that itself is a marker of like how power, how nation state, how dominant groups actually have impact on these people. So that is, I think, yeah, that's all.
Thank you. Last, yes. Yes. Yes.
Let me take 20 seconds. That there is a vast literary output, produced in Urdu in this part of Dhaka. and most of them are already lost. So I often think that it really will be wonderful if someone can work to archive those literary outputs. That's all.
Yeah, that would be
Javed
actually
bhai,
lovely.
I think we started when we launched this project, and I started interviewing met you. I mean, I wouldn't call it interview, talking to you and knowing you, and then getting to know Shamim bhai and Haikal Hashmi. We did start talking about, and I think Javed bhai, I had a very brief conversation with you that I wanted to, in fact, start another phase of this, of kind of collecting, because Shamim bhai, for example, has a copious amounts of diaries, like he's constantly writing, like, and we collected only a snippet of that. And how wonderful would that be to collect his kind of collection of diaries from Haikal Hashmi as well, and also photographs. And then I did want to start on that, but then, you know, pandemic started and we were in disarray and we needed to finish this. But that's something definitely in at least my mind, our mind, that we want to kind of think about that, because that would be a really wonderful thing to take on.
Really. Okay.
Last question. Let me just read it. Okay. I think somebody's saying, like, referencing Nazesh Afroz, since you mentioned quote unquote families, one thing caught my mind, that how the way families and nations are differentiated, how the family imagines the nation to be, and how nation state leading to an imagination of Bangladeshi national character. Can you elaborate? And then he's asking, maybe Said Firdaus can also elaborate
Sorry, can you please repeat the question? I could not hear it properly.
The question again, like, I'm just reading it. So since you mentioned, you meaning Nazesh Afroz, families, one thing caught my mind, that how families and nations are differentiated, how the family imagines the nation to be, and how nation state leading to an imagination of a Bangladeshi character. I think what they're trying to say is that at the kind of the level of the family, right? How you conceptualize nations, and there is a certain way that you do, and then the nation state itself, like, leads with an imagination of a national character. And maybe the question is, again, the question that the person is asking, how do you elaborate it? I would interpret that maybe they're asking that how that connection is happening. So maybe they're asking us to elaborate on that. So asking you and Said Firdaus.
Okay, I think I will leave the second part of that question, like the Bangladeshi identity part, to Said. I mean, I don't think I am in a position to talk about that, but because I
just
do not
to kind
understand
of like orient,
dynamics,
we have like maybe 3 to 5 minutes. So
I'll leave it to Said to talk about that. But coming to the first part of it, so in terms of the families, I mean, again, if you mentioned that, and even it came through the earlier question, that the ideas of these families who talk about their past.
Nazish, I think it would be better if you turn off your video, because I think
so
it's
they are called
breaking up again.
Video, okay.
Yeah, turn off video. I think it's breaking up.
Okay, am I coming clear now?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So, so when a lot of these families who have gone through this process of getting evicted and then relocating themselves in another part, for them, I think, I don't know if they had any choice in that, in thinking about which, national identities they wanted to have. Like, I mean, you read out a little bit of a snippet from one of your respondents, that how they did not know. They just, because somebody did not really gel with the family, that is why he left for Pakistan. So there was an opportunity. So that way, I think a lot of these families, they did not have any choice in deciding what they wanted to do and what their identity would have been. But at the same time, they could never really forget where they belonged. So I'm talking about the previous generation, the first generation we are talking about. And so through all our interviews, even I think in your interviews as well, you must have realized that the nostalgia that comes through and the kind of emotion that is attached to them. And so, yes, they accept the reality and they say, yes, this is our new home and this is our new national identity. But at the same time, they really cannot forego what they left behind. So that way, I think it's very complex. But for the third generation, it's much more straightforward. One of the questions in the first phase of the interview was, what do you think about border? And in that, the third generation we spoke to, they were very categorical. So they accepted the border. They said, yes, I'm Bangladeshi. Yes, I'm Indian. So for them, there was a closure in 1947. And so that way for them, there is absolutely no confusion in their mind. But for the first generation, it is much more fluid.
Okay, let's go to Said because we
just to cut it short, just in one sentence, like when people think about, people actually don't use the political landscape. People don't think about the political boundaries and those things. People think about the extension of self, desh. Like one person was telling that her husband was her desh, and she came to this land with her husband, and when her husband had died, she lost the desh. She lost the country. So it's like nation, state, they have their political definition, but in people's imagination, in people's experience, it's not the political identity. In people's experience, it's the extension of self, my nearest one, the surrounding I had grown up within. So that is the thing. Nation state always imposes this idea of political imagination and this grand idea of imagine community and those things. So I think they are very different. But yes, what Najesh actually said, I would conclude here.
Said, you muted yourself. Can you unmute? I think you accidentally.
Sorry. Yeah. Yes, when the nation state actually imposed the political marker, we cannot undo that. And that has real consequences on people's life and meaning. So they cannot deny it. And they have to cope up. They have to maneuver like borderland people who are living across the border, relatives across the border, friends across the border, livelihood across the border. Like they really have to maneuver. So they cannot actually deny the reality. But within themselves, they know the desh is not only the cartography. Desh is not only the political territory. Yes, I think it's enough.
I think we are, out of time, but I would really like to thank our speakers, Anam, Nazir, Khalid Hussein, Javed Hussein, Shamim Bhai. I think we had a really wonderful conversation. I would like to end thanking Goethe-Institut very much for supporting us. Particularly, we started the project in 2019 and we were to finish it middle of 2020. And then obviously, we know what happened with the pandemic. So by kind of supporting us all throughout, we are very happy to launch it. And I would conclude by thanking our team. We had a wonderful team of researchers, besides Said and I, there were 4 researchers that worked with us. I would like to thank them. People who worked on the website, illustrators, Council of Minorities that Khalid Bhai founded, without, which we would not have been able to make those connections. And also, like any effort of this kind is a group effort, a collective effort. For example, kind of going to places to scan. So I went to our friends at Drake Picture Library, for example. We went to the National Archives, for example, to collect certain archival documents. So the project really came together through those efforts. So I really like to thank them in conclusion. And just I would like to end by sharing I wanted to share the screen, but I will not. But as a reminder that the project is available on longingbelonging.net, again, longingbelonging.net, and it's available also through Goethe-Institut's website under Inherited Memories. You can find Longing Belonging, and you can, see and read about the project, read about the team, and of course, the most important thing is to read the chronicles themselves. So thank you again, and have a good evening. And I like to thank our moderator, Dana, as well. So everybody who worked with us at every point of the project, everybody's contribution was very valuable. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
All right.
everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.